Well, shalom, my friends, and welcome to our Bible study, The Bible on One Foot. And today's session is going to be about the age of human government. So let's go ahead and begin with our first slide, which is from the charts that we've been using as kind of a definitely a resource for this Bible study. The age of human government, as this is labeled at the top of the chart, is the third dispensation. Again, dispensations are periods of stewardship, oikonomos in the Greek language. And there's a little dash here and a parenthesis saying this is the post-diluvian. The last one that we did that led up to the flood of Noah's Ark was the antediluvian. This is the post-diluvian. So this takes place after the flood. And also, let's go down to the kind of the bottom of the chart and look at some of the topics that we will be dealing with. First of all, God's covenant with Noah, and that is depicted here on the left-hand side of the chart, and it comes from Genesis chapter 8 and into chapter 19. Chapter 9 up to verse 19. We will also be discussing the peopling or the repeopling of the earth, the repopulation of the earth after all the humans except Noah and his family perished in the flood of Noah's Ark. One of the things that we will be noticing is this red ribbon of salvation, or the road of redemption, or whatever we're going to call this thing. I should look it up in Dr. Ead's Bible study and see what he calls this red road. But it comes from the ark. And of course, the only people that were saved on the ark were Noah and his family. So it continues through Noah and the covenant that God made with him. And then we will also be talking about Noah's three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And I think they are indicated here in the order of their age. I believe Ham was the oldest, Shem was the middle child, and Japheth was the youngest, I believe. Usually when you discuss the three sons, Shem is mentioned first, because the red road of redemption goes through Shem and his family, his seed, his descendants after him. And then we will also be talking about the Tower of Babel, or Babel. It's Bavel in Hebrew, with a soft second B or bet sound. So Bavel. Tower of Babel. We'll talk about what was going on there, what led up to it, and so forth. And then we'll talk about the dispersion, which really kind of brings me to one of the major subjects that I want to talk about. You can see in this diagram that Ham, Shem, and Japheth, Noah's sons, each produced a branch of the family tree, but Shem was God's choice for the road to redemption. So from each one of those families, you'll notice there's a convergence on the Tower of Babel. And there's a city there by that name, Babel, or Bavel, or Babylon in our English Bibles, which is also called Bavel in Hebrew. So that's significant. And then after the Tower of Bavel, you will see that the populations of the earth dispersed once again. One of the things that we need to appreciate is when Noah's Ark finally ended up on dry land, and Noah and his family exited the Ark and kind of took up their lives again. And one of the commands that Adam gave to that family, and it's mainly going to be to the sons and the sons' wives, was to be fruitful and multiply and repopulate the earth, which implies a certain degree of dispersion. And we will look at a map in this Bible study to show where the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, where they dispersed to on that map. So you'll see that there was, after the Noah's Ark incident, there was a dispersion and a repopulation of a wide variety of places, particularly in the Middle East, but something drew them together to Babel, to Babylon. And it was partially to do with the tower, but the tower was just kind of a symbol of what was going on. And we'll talk about the thing that was going on. Then after the flood, of course, the dispersion takes place once again. So one other thing that I kind of wanted to mention is something that Chuck Missler points out about the names here. We've already talked about the significance of Hebrew names. Let's see here. Ham is the way Ham is pronounced in Hebrew, and Ham is a word that means heat or hotness or something like that. Shem is the Hebrew word for a name, for a person's name or a place name or something like that. And Japhet is the Hebrew word for beauty or attractiveness. So Chuck Missler says that Noah's sons were named hot, famous, and beautiful, which is kind of true, So that may be a good way for you to remember at least 3 Hebrew words there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start looking at our text here, which begins in Genesis 8:20. And remember, this is after the flood. Then Noah built an altar to Yahweh and took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So Noah builds an altar there. He's in a different place than they were before. In that year or whatever, a year plus a few days, I think 17 days, something like that. The ark drifted in the floodwaters and came to rest on Mount Ararat. And we'll take a look at a little map a little bit later on and show you where Mount Ararat is. So whatever kind of worship facilities that Noah had before the flood were of no use to him anymore. So he gets off the ark, and one of the first things he does is builds an altar to the Lord. He wants to offer sacrifices to the Lord, which just gives you some understanding of the religious devotion that Noah had. And of course, this is one of the reasons that he was chosen by God to be the one to carry on the human race. He took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The distinctions between clean animals and unclean animals was not really formalized until the law of Moses, which takes place about 1500 BCE or BC. So we've got a ways to go here. But the fact that that God, had like a different destiny for both the clean and the unclean animals on the ark is an indication that dates back before the law of Moses, that people knew which kinds of animals were appropriate for offering as sacrifices and which ones were not. Keep in mind that at this point in biblical history, all the animals of the earth and all the people on the earth were vegetarians. The consumption of meat was not a thing yet. Later on in the law of Moses, the distinction between clean animals and unclean animals also applies to which kind of animals are appropriate not only for sacrifice, but also which ones are edible. So anyway, we have we have an awareness of clean and unclean animals. We have sacrifices being made. The Lord had instructed that of the clean animals, there were supposed to be 7 pairs or 14 total animals instead of just the 2 or the 2 pair of the unclean animals. So the unclean animals, enough of them were placed on the ark to repopulate the earth with those kinds of animals. Same thing with the clean animals, but some of those clean animals would be used for sacrifice, and that's what Noah used to offer his sacrifices on the altar. This is a good opportunity to emphasize that already in the Garden of Eden, after Adam and Eve had fallen into sin, God demonstrated that for them the method that he would use to redeem mankind. And that would be by shedding the blood of a substitute, a living substitute. The Bible says the wages of sin is death. We all deserve to die for our sins. And also, without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins, no forgiveness of sins. This principle was repeated in the worship experience of Cain and Abel. God made it clear to both of them that an appropriate sacrifice, at least for the forgiveness of sins, was an animal substitution. And Abel offered that sacrifice, that acceptable sacrifice, and Cain did not. And the Lord explained about sin offerings and about where and how to offer them and so forth, and how he could master sin, how he could dominate sin in his life by those sacrifices. So the Bible tells us that the Lord smelled a soothing aroma, a ruach nachoach in Hebrew. And so these animals, of course, their blood was shed as the necessity. Without the shedding of blood, no forgiveness of sins. And then normally in an animal sacrifice, only a part of the animal is actually placed on the altar and burned up. Like the edible parts of an animal were consumed, and that's why later on the kosher laws, the clean and unclean animal laws, will apply to the kinds of offerings that people can eat. The priest could eat some, the offerer could eat some, and sometimes even the offerer's family could eat some. But again, at this point, the offerings that were offered here by Noah were not consumed by him. That will come shortly, but at this point, Noah and his family are still vegetarians. So burnt offerings are offered on the smell of cooking. It probably smelled like a barbecue, and that was a pleasing aroma to God. Not just the smell of the cooking of the flesh of these animals, but also what it meant to God. It meant that Noah was faithfully obeying this paradigm of animal sacrifices, the substitutionary atonement, we might call it. And that was pleasing to him, that this precious child of his, Noah, and Noah's family were doing what was necessary to be in a relationship with God through faith, their faith being credited to them as righteousness. So then Yahweh said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake. Although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night, shall not cease. I guess we really need to kind of add a qualification to this now that we've got the New Testament. God kind of swore that he would never destroy the earth's population completely, as he had done in the flood of Noah's Ark. And the flood of Noah's Ark is actually the second universal flood that God used to judge. The first one was demonstrated in the condition of the earth in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was on the surface of the deep. The surface of the deep. So after Lucifer's sin and the sin of the fallen angels that joined him, God judged the earth with a flood and darkness and so forth, and then put it back together in 6 days. Now he's done it again. He's flooded the entire earth, a universal flood. It was not a local flood. It covered the entire surface of the earth. The Bible makes it clear that even the highest mountaintop on the globe was covered to a depth of, I think, 15 feet or something like that, or 15 cubits. So it was a universal flood. And God says he's not going to do that again. But the New Testament makes it clear that there are still some judgments in God's toolkit. And at the very end of this present age, when God judges the earth for a final time, at least the earth will be consumed in fire. And the New Testament says we look forward to new heavens and a new earth, and the New Jerusalem, the holy eternal city. So the fire, would seem to be kind of a purifying, kind of a ridding the earth of sin and everything that prompts people to sin and so forth by those fires. And I'll wager that the new heavens and the new earth will be more glorious than even these. But at this point, God is making a covenant with Noah. On our chart, it talks about God's covenant with Noah, and that's what we're reading right now. So Noah offers sacrifices to God, and God makes a covenant with him. First of all, at this point, he's just speaking in his heart. He's kind of coming up with the idea, and he hasn't spoken it to Noah yet. So then God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." So this is the point where the offspring of Noah and his sons are supposed to scatter around the earth. And of course, they do that by the principle of reproduction, and also by moving to various locations and, populating the various regions of the earth. Since we're talking about human government here, one of the things that I want to mention is that one of the principles that kind of is kind of hinted at or emerges by demonstration in the Bible is that smaller government in local areas is better than larger centralized government. Larger centralized government tends to lead to kind of godlessness. Let me put it this way. It leads to agnosticism, a doubting about God's existence, and also atheism, a belief that God doesn't exist anymore. So when you get a lot of people together in close proximity to each other, like we see here, you see a lot of godlessness and immorality emerge, and it's just inviting God's judgment. So God says, if you spread yourself all over the planet, so there are like local communities, and since we're talking about human government, the humans that are put in charge of the government on the local area know all the people, they know the culture, they know the concerns, the challenges, the priorities of people in the local community. And God's principles of government are applied from that perspective. In a large centralized government, where you've got kind of one size fits all, there are a lot of laws and procedures that come out of a centralized government like that go out to local communities and really don't, they aren't appropriate for those communities. And I think we see a lot of that in our country now. The federal government has gotten a lot larger and more powerful than the founding fathers imagined. When this country, America, was formed, the founders had in mind a lot of personal freedom and liberty, a lot of personal responsibility, and then government at the local area, the local level. The states and the local governments were much more important to the founding fathers than centralized government. They were accustomed to having a king rule over them, and there's nothing more centralized than that. And so they were suspicious of large centralized government, and they, to the best of their ability, limited the ability of the national government, the federal government, from obtaining too much power. The U.S. Constitution is mainly to limit the power of central government. And that may be one of the reasons why God told the people to spread out and populate widely distributed regions of the population and govern them accordingly. Smaller and more local is better than larger and more centralized. And we'll see that this large centralized government here ended in tragedy. Okay, so let's see, where are we here? God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth and every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Now, the idea that they're given into the hand of humans has to do with dominion. When God had created Adam and Eve, he gave them dominion over all that he had created. And when they sinned, they kind of forfeited their dominion to Satan, to Lucifer, to the devil. One of the most important principles of any kind of government is the consent of the governed. If you don't have people cooperating with whatever government you have, no matter what type of government, no matter what style of government it is, you've got rebellion on your hands, and that government will be overthrown and replaced, as was the case in the American Revolution. So the consent of the government, the consent of the governed is critical to the authority of any government. Adam and Eve were placed in a position where they could choose which government they would consent to. Would it be God's government? He had given them a law about the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Or they could consent to Satan's government. Satan campaigned on the issue that he had better things in store for Adam and Eve than God did, and God was kind of holding out on them and cramping their style and so forth. And they consented to Satan's government. So here, a certain level of dominion is placed back into the control of human beings, and the animal creation will be aware of that. The fear of human beings would be the experience of all these animals. Every living thing that lives shall be food for you. And this is the beginning of eating meat for human beings. We've mentioned already that up to this point, human beings were vegetarians. This term, everything that lives, seems to not distinguish between clean animals and unclean animals. And maybe by trial and error, and maybe as a result of prayer, human beings will learn what animals they want to eat and what animals they don't want to eat. And we'll talk more about the clean and unclean animals when we get to the law of Moses. But basically, when it comes to mammals that human beings consume, the Bible regulations for clean animals, edible animals, are that they have to have a split hoof and they have to chew the cud. And those kinds of animals are sheep and goats, and definitely not pigs. But the clean animals are basically those that eat grain and vegetation. They're not scavengers. They don't eat other animals and things like that. So certainly, grain-fed or herbivores are healthier. That will be discovered at some point. That will be regulated at some point. But here it looks like every living thing is fair game to be fair game. God says, I have given you all things, even as the green herbs, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood in it. The idea is if you're going to eat an animal, it has to be butchered properly and all the blood drained out. For a number of reasons. I think there are health reasons, why blood should not be consumed. But I think more significantly, God is talking about the fact here that the blood is like the kind of like the container of life. It's the life's blood is where the soul, I don't know, like the program or the sort of the DNA, the wiring for the soul is in the blood. I guess it's through the blood that the DNA is passed from one generation to another and so forth. So the blood is precious. It's not, one creature's blood is not to be consumed by another creature. This idea of the sacredness of blood is really recognized in a lot of pagan cultures. There is I don't want to get too gross here, but there is an old battlefield ritual that when one army was defeated by another, that the blood of defeated enemies would be drunk by the conquering soldiers because they wanted to take the spirit and the courage of these dead warriors whom they were honoring by doing this. They wanted to take it into their own bodies so they could be strengthened and so they could be more courageous and so forth. So in a number of different ways, human life resides in the blood, and God says it's not to be consumed. In Jewish kosher regulations, any meat that is consumed by Jewish people really has to be kind of checked out, quality controlled by rabbis who are trained to observe butchering techniques and make sure that just every speck of blood is drained from meat that's consumed by kosher observant Jews. So don't eat any meat with the blood still in it. Let's see. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, from the hand of every man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. So up until this point in human history, and quite a bit of time has passed, we already said 1700, I think 1700 years or thereabouts for the time between the 6 days and the flood of Noah. So over that time period, God took responsibility for executing punishments and appropriate judgments for violations of his law. That's what Cain was concerned about, that if he took one life, maybe he, will pay God would kind of punish him more than he deserved. Lamech, the same kind of thing. If Abel's blood is made accountable or responsible to Cain 7 times over, Lamech says it'll be 77 times from me, because the murder or the killing that I did was probably less appropriate, less defensible than that of Cain. So what God is doing is saying, up until now, I have enforced my laws, I have executed judgment. Now that's going to be man's responsibility. So now, if somebody dies for indefensible reasons, then it's no longer God who is going to execute the judgment on the guilty party, but human beings are going to do that. And this really is the beginning of human government. And I will say that all human government, no matter what form is chosen, no matter what the paradigm of human government is, every human government and every leader in government, every politician should understand that they have the authority to be involved in human government only under the supervision and only as a submissive kind of a servant role to God himself. So God is the ultimate judge. He is the ultimate ruler. And any human government is by God's permission and by the authority that he grants for it. So it should make leaders humble. And unfortunately, most politicians today are anything but humble. So God demands a reckoning for the lifeblood of a human being. If an animal would kill a man, then the animal is going to pay the penalty. If another man kills a human being, then God will require an appropriate judgment and penalty for the man who does that. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And as for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it. So just kind of a reinforcement of the admonition in verse 1 to be fruitful and multiply. So it's the beginning of human government. I've already mentioned that the biblical model for government is smaller government, more local, is better than larger centralized government. We're going to see that here in the Genesis 9 through 11 story. We are also going to see that when God sets up the government for Israel, it will be the elders of the tribes who will be responsible for governing in their tribal areas. So that's kind of equivalent to the states in the United States. So the tribal leaders and the tribal government that takes place there is going to be kind of like state governments in America. All right, let's go on to our next portion of this text. We pick it up at verse 11. Then God spoke to Noah and to his son, saying, as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you. This covenant that God is making here, that establishes human government and implements meat into the human diet, and his promise not to destroy everything by a flood again, is called the Noahic covenant. So even God calls it my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. This is called the Noahic covenant. And with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So what we've seen in the flood of Noah's Ark is typical. It's a pattern of God's judgment and the punishment that follows. It was very severe. An awful lot of people died in the flood of Noah's Ark. But one thing I think is worth pointing out is prior to God's judgment, God gave plenty of opportunity for repentance and faithfulness rather than rebellion and sin. So, there were plenty of prophetic warnings that the flood was coming and that people should repent. Of course, they did not do that. It's interesting that when judgment does come, God preserves some of his chosen people, some of the believers. He preserves them through the judgment. That would be Noah and his family. They went through an ordeal of about a year-long flood, living in the ark, as God preserved them, kept them alive through the judgment. But there was one guy, Enoch, that we talked about, that God took him off of the earth before judgment took place. Look at some of the other judgments. A little bit later down the road, we'll talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, God checked out the situation there and determined that it was due for justice. But before the fire and brimstone fell, he got his people, Lot and his family, he got them out of Sodom. They kind of left reluctantly. The angels had to kind of force them out of Sodom, but God removed them before the judgment fell. So this might be indicative, for those of you who are familiar with the kind of the ultimate judgment that's going to come on the earth in the Great Tribulation. There are many Christians, and I'm one of them, and I will be teaching this belief that before the Great Tribulation begins, God will take his chosen people out of this world, take them off of the earth and take them to heaven in what is called the rapture. This is a resurrection event, the resurrection of the righteous. There will be believers who go through the tribulation, and God will protect and preserve some of them through the tribulation. Many of the believers of the Great Tribulation will be martyred for their faith. But nonetheless, even if they die physically, they have the hope and the gift of eternal life. This pattern of removing some of God's precious people before judgment begins, and then others kind of preserving them in the midst of judgment is it's a good pattern to be aware of, because we will see it repeated numerous times in the Bible. So yeah, God's going to establish his covenant with you and your descendants, with every living creature, birds, cattle, every beast of the earth, everybody that goes out of the ark. Thus I will establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Here's where he gets specific and says, I'm not going to send another flood, but the judgment by fire, the consuming fires of judgment will eventually fall. Chapter 9 continues in verse 12. God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I will make between me and you and every creature that is with you. I think the word sign there is ot in Hebrew, kind of a significant mark, kind of a milestone that God uses to as kind of a reminder of this covenant. So this is a sign of the covenant I will make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I've established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So the sign of the covenant is the rainbow. The Hebrew word is kashat. That's the word for a bow and arrow. What it actually means is a curved thing. So the rainbow is curved. When it rains and we see the rainbow in the clouds, it's curved. It looks kind of like an archer's bow. That's the word in Hebrew for the sign of the covenant. And the sign was to impact two different people. For the human observers of the rainbow, just the next time you see one, just remember, well, God has promised not to destroy us all by a flood. So take some comfort in that, comfort in God's grace, and his dedication to redeeming all mankind. But also when God would see it in the sky, it would be a reminder to him that if judgment is necessary, it should not be by a universal flood like Noah's Ark and the flood of the fall of Satan. Verse 18, now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. Canaan would be the son of Ham, so that would be Noah's grandchild. And these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. So here again, just a reminder that no human beings survived the flood except these 8 people. And I get the impression that Noah and his wife were finished with their childbearing time. So these 3 sons of Noah were responsible for repopulating the earth. One of the things I want to say about the name Shem, you may have heard the term Semites or anti-Semites. Semites are descendants of Shem. I suppose in Hebrew you would call it Shemites, but that's where the term Semites and anti-Semites come from. And there are a number of nations that emerge from the Semitic peoples. So, for example, from this family come obviously Jewish people and the nation of Israel, but also the nations and populations of Edom and Ammon and Moab and Canaan, the Canaanites who would populate the promised land before it was inherited by the Jewish people, were from the Hamitic line. And on our chart here, it talks about the Hamitic people settling in Africa and Arabia. So on a map, I think we've got a map in here that we can kind of point that out. Then the Semitic peoples produced the Assyrian people, which today I guess would include the populations of modern day Syria and Iraq. Palestine is in here as well. Palestine is kind of a strange word, and I'll have more to say about that later on. And then the Japhetites populated Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey, and Europe, which is where I think most of the ancestors of the American population came from. So that all came from the sons of Noah. So here's our chart again, just a bigger picture of it. And I think we're going to turn our attention now to a different subject, and that is the genealogies of Genesis chapter 10. We looked just very briefly at the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5 and emphasized the significance of the names there, and how if you line those the leaders of those generations up in the order that they lived, it kind of spelled out a gospel message. So I don't want to spend a lot of time in a very lengthy genealogy, but I want to look at a couple of significant things here in chapter 10. Now, this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the sons born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were, and then chapter 10 lists them. I'll show you a map where a lot of those descendants of Japheth settled in the earth. That might be interesting to you. I'll do that a little bit later. Starting in Genesis 6, the genealogy of the sons of Ham is given. And then in verse 8, it talks about one of those descendants of Ham, whose name was Cush. Cush is the ancient biblical era name for Ethiopia. I don't know when the name of Ethiopia was changed to Ethiopia, but in ancient times it was called Cush, and the people who lived there were Cushites. So Cush beget Nimrod. I want to talk a little bit about Nimrod. The Bible doesn't say a lot about him, but the traditions of Judaism and ancient history says quite a bit about Nimrod. The root word of his name is Yarad, which means to go down. It's also a word for rebellion, and Nimrod lives up to his name. Cush's son Nimrod began to be a mighty one in the earth. I think this is Givor in Hebrew, which means to be powerful and influential. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Nothing wrong with hunting, because now the Lord has placed animal flesh on the menu for human beings. But one of the things that you will notice about people who do a lot of hunting is their experience of taking the life of another living being, and appropriately so when it comes to hunting, prepares them very well for a willingness and ability to take a human life, either appropriately or non-appropriately. In the Bible, there is such a thing as capital punishment. And, there are certain very heinous crimes that the Bible says should be punished by death. And some people need to be skilled in the art and science of methods of execution. And hunters are well trained for that. So Nimrod was a mighty hunter. Again, there was nothing wrong with being a hunter, but it prepared for him to be willing to be violent in his dealings with other human beings. And the traditions say that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. That's why they said that. And the beginning of the kingdom was Bavel. That's the name of the place where the Tower of Babel was made. Another place that Nimrod established was Erech, Akkad, and Kalna in the land of Shinar. And I'll point out where Shinar is on the map. From that land, he went to Assyria and rebuilt Nineveh. Nineveh is a very old and famous city. Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city. So I think what is being pointed out here is that Nimrod was rebellious. He was a violent man, hunting animals and also men. I think the trend or the tendency for people to gravitate toward such powerful leaders and individuals as Nimrod, and to build large, probably fortress cities that were easily defensible and could be a base of operations for military excursions and things like that. I think that's where this tendency began. And, I would call this tendency global government. And it's very popular in the world today. And what you're looking for in global government is kind of a common language between diverse nations, a common currency like the euro in the European Union, shared goals and shared values. And I would say, using the European Union as an example, godliness is not one of their highest priorities. It's a very secular part of the world. So a lot of emphasis on finance and power and influence and things like that. It's kind of a godless, large attempt at global government. And those kinds of attempts are almost always evil. So these are some of the places that Nimrod built. Let me see what comes next here. Before I go on, let me talk a little bit more about Nimrod. I'm going to say that here in Bavel, since Nimrod built that city, that this was his headquarters. This was the place where he ruled as a human governor. And the tradition goes, and there's a fairly famous book that was written about what I'm going to share with you. I believe the author's name was Alexander Hislop, and he wrote a book called Two Babylons or something like that. Hislop is just telling this tradition that has been in circulation and in the history books for a long time. Nimrod established this large and powerful global organization. And as often happens, it happened in the Roman Empire. Such leaders who have such extraordinary power and influence begin to see themselves as more than ordinary human beings. So the story goes that Nimrod married a woman named Semiramis, and that when Nimrod eventually died, because he was a human being after all, that their child, whose name was Tammuz, was seen to be a divine being. And Nimrod was kind of a semi-god. Semiramis had qualities of kind of a goddess, and then their son Tammuz was thought to be the son of God. And the religion, which we'll talk about in a few minutes when we get to the Tower of Babel story, is kind of a pagan, anti-God of the Bible religion. It is, I believe, a satanic religion, and it began there at Babel, and remained there in history from generation to generation. The Babylonian religion kind of ruled the world of paganism. And then I believe it was when the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persians, the headquarters of the Babylonian religion moved from Babylon to a city in Asia Minor in Turkey called Pergamum. And Pergamum is one of the 7 cities that received letters from Yeshua, from Jesus Christ, in the book of Revelation. And Yeshua's characterization of that place was that it was where Satan's throne dwelt. Because the Babylonian religion in Jesus' day had moved from Babylon to Pergamum, and stayed there until the Greeks and the Romans came to power, and then the Babylonian religion left Pergamum and settled in Rome. And of course, Hislop and the story goes on from there to associate many of the pagan aspects of Roman Catholicism with this ancient Babylonian religion that was begun by Nimrod. And of course, as it moved to different places and as it was embraced by different territories in the world, the names were changed, I suppose, to protect the innocent. Nimrod might have gotten a different name, but a lot of the pagan gods and goddesses in the different cultures are just using their own cultural names to talk about the ancient Babylonian religion. So the ancient Babylonian religion, they kind of the religion that competed in biblical times with the biblical religion, that the true religion of the Bible, competed with it and continues to compete with it to this day. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background about Nimrod and the culture and the government that he initiated, but also the religion that is associated with him. Genesis 10:21, children were also born to Shem. So we've talked about Ham's descendants, Japheth's descendants, and now we're talking about Shem's descendants. I don't want to talk about all of them, but I want to talk about a couple of them. Shem was the father of all the children of Ever. Ever is, this is what it looks like in the Hebrew. And this is the root word for the Hebrew language. This is how you spell Hebrew. Yivrit is the Hebrew language, and it comes from Ever, which is this guy's name. Now, the meaning of Ever is to cross over. And who knows what the crossing over associated with Ever was. He may have crossed over the Euphrates River to settle in a new place. It may be that he was one who, when the languages were confused in association with the Tower of Babel, that that he preserved the Hebrew language from developing into one of the other foreign languages. So Ever is a key person, and the Hebrews, the Hebrew people, Hebrew speaking people, and Hebrew cultured people spring from Ever, the brother of Japhet the elder. And so this is what this is. This is a little confusing. Japhet the elder makes it sound like Japhet was the oldest of the three sons. But this is the line of Shem. So Shem is said to be the elder, not the eldest brother, but the elder brother of Japhet. And so I don't know how significant the order of birth is, but I think Ham is the oldest, Shem is the second, and Japhet. And that makes Shem the elder brother of Japhet. To Ever were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg. He's the God I want to talk about. For in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Yoktan. I don't want to talk about Yoktan at all, but I do want to talk about Peleg because his name means divided. And one of the theories is there are multiple theories about Peleg. One of the theories about why he was named Peleg is because in his day, the Tower of Babel broke up the centralized, joined cultures of the time and scattered them out and stuff. So Peleg was born during a time of great division and scattering of the people of the globe. And so that may be what it's talking about. Another thing that I think it may be talking about is the fact that if you've ever looked at a globe of the earth, if you look at the west coast of Europe and Africa and the east coast of North and South America, it looks like you could fit them together. They look like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that need to be fitted together. And I think that could possibly be the case. Remember, after the flood of Noah's Ark, the geology and the topography of the earth changed dramatically. Which makes it very difficult to figure out exactly where the Garden of Eden was and, where some significant places pre-flood are. So it may very well be that during the lifetime of Peleg, that the Lord caused what do you call that? The tectonic plates of the Earth's surface to shift and form an ocean between the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere, that ocean being the Atlantic Ocean and so forth. So that may have happened during Peleg's lifetime. One of the questions that might answer is, from the Bible and from ancient cultures, we believe that all human life and culture had its beginning in Mesopotamia, in the Middle East here, the area that we're studying in the Bible. But the question then remains, with a big Atlantic Ocean and even bigger Pacific Ocean lying between the other continents, how did human populations get from one continent to another? And there are all kinds of theories about that, sailing ships and crossing over the North and South Pole and all those things. But if the Earth's population scattered around the African and Asian continents in the era that we're talking about, if they scattered to a variety of places, then when the shift took place, when the division took place of the continents, there were already people in Europe. There were already people in what would become North and South America and some of the other continents as well. So I'm not sure exactly what the significance of Peleg's name is, but I suspect it is great. Verse 32, these were the families of the sons of Noah according to their generations and their nations. And from the nation, and from these, the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. Here is the map that I wanted to show you of where these various families of the descendants of Noah's three sons went to. So the first thing that we'll look at on the map is the key here, the legend here, that shows that all the areas depicted on the map in red are the descendants of Japhet. So here they are settling in Asia Minor and Europe. The green parts are the descendants of Ham, so that's Africa and, part of Saudi Arabia here, like down in the southern part of Saudi Arabia. And then the yellow colored parts are the descendants of Shem, and that's the Middle Eastern area here, where an awful lot of the Bible is centered. And it's kind of the place where God chose to set up the promised land. Now, interestingly enough, here's the land of Canaan, which ultimately would become the promised land. But right now, at this point on this map, it is green. It's part of Ham's descendants. Canaan, remember, was a descendant, was a grandchild of Noah, the son of Ham. And so this is where Ham's descendants settled. Now, eventually, it's going to be taken from them and turned yellow, but not for quite a while. Some of the other names that you might be interested in are Shinar. We talk about the plain of Shinar, which is a very important area in biblical history. And it's right here close to Babylon, or Bavel, the city that Nimrod made. There's a place called Ur of the Chaldeans, which is down here close to the Persian Gulf. It's probably down here close to the Persian Gulf. And that's where Abraham was born and grew up. And it wasn't until he was an old man that he left. Here's Ever, the progenitor of the Hebrew race. Here's Peleg. Of course, they were close in their family tree. Here's Aram, which is the Hebrew word for Syria. Oh, what else are we interested in? Elam is the word for ancient Persia. So Persia was in the south, and Madai or Media was in the north. The Medo-Persian Empire would eventually become significant. Here's the plateau of Iran out there. Here is Cush that we talked about before, which is Ethiopia. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. And here we have, what is this, Lower and Upper Egypt, I believe. Havilah is one of the places that that was mentioned in the description of the Garden of Eden, but you also see Havilah placed up here. So a lot of this is guesswork. The other names that I want to point out are Magog, Meshach, and Tubal. And those are important for people who are familiar with chapters 37 and following of Ezekiel, because he describes a war that will take place in the last days called the War of Gog and Magog. And this is where the people of Gog and Magog will come from, Tubal, Meshach, and Magog. This is modern day Turkey. Now, it wasn't long ago, I think it was in 2005. Let me have that date wrong. It was around 2005 that I took a group of travelers. We went to Greece, and we traveled all around Greece, seeing the cities where the Apostle Paul, ministered to, where he planted churches in Greece and in Europe. Followed along the second missionary journey there. But part of our trip was to take a cruise from Athens over here to Asia Minor in Turkey. And marketing material that we received from the travel company that we traveled with was that the Turkish people were very moderate in their Islamic theology, and they just loved Christians, and they embraced Christians, and Christians operated freely and openly in Turkey, and that's what we could expect. But when we got there, when we got to Turkey, we talked to some Christians who lived in Turkey, and they said that's not the case at all. That Turkey is turning increasingly radical in their Islamic beliefs and practice, and the Christians were being persecuted at the time. Well, since then, in the what would that be, 25 or 26? I'm sorry, 15 or 16 years since then, Turkey has gone extremely radical and is probably one of the most radical countries on the planet there. So this may be an indication that the stage is being set for the Gog-Magog war. And this is where that all will be happening. And of course, those people will come north into the promised land and be soundly defeated. Yavan is the Hebrew name for Greece. Here's Tarshish. I think that's guesswork. They're saying Tarshish is associated with Italy, but I'm not sure that's the case. And then here are a lot of the tribal names that go with the promised land. So this square is enlarged over here, and mainly populated by descendants of Cain, who would eventually be dominated by the descendants of Shem. Okay, that's enough of our map. That's where the three sons basically kind of settled in these different areas. So now you know. Here's our big chart again. We want to spend a little time talking about the Tower of Babel. And I drew a little map here, or I didn't draw a map. I drew on a map here to discuss some things that I think will be important as we talk about the Tower of Babel. Let me I think what I'll do is introduce this with, here's my little Satan chart that pops up again and talks about all the work that Satan did. Here's the rebellion against God and casting down and formless and void. He shows up again in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3 as the tempter. We said he showed up again in Genesis 6 with the intermarriage of the sons of God and the daughters of men and the production of the Nephilim in order to try to prevent the seed of woman from coming into the world. And here he is again. He shows up in Bavel in Genesis chapter 11 in this story. And one of the things I want to do is associate this activity of Satan with Nimrod. I think we could say Nimrod is kind of a type of the Antichrist. And interestingly enough, when the Antichrist emerges on the scene, one of the places that he will establish as his operating headquarters is the city of Bavel. You know, I think Nimrod is part of Satan's plan here in the Garden of Eden. I'm sorry, in the Tower of Babel. So Genesis 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech, and this is one of the key characteristics of global empires is common currency, common language. A lot of common things like making all the unique nations into one big mixture. One language and one speech. So communication was not a problem for anybody. And I'm of the opinion that one language was Hebrew. That Hebrew was the language that was spoken all over the world at this point in Earth's history. And, you know, maybe this is the significance of Ever, who retained the Hebrew language for his family and his culture. It came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar. Now, what I've written on the map here is an arrow pointing to where I just showed you where Shinar is. uh, on the previous map that we looked at. And I wanted to point out that here on this map, you can barely see it. It says Mount Ararat is here, and that's where the ark landed. So it says here, it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, they settled in Shinar. Well, it looks like it would be a southerly direction, maybe moving toward the east, not from the east. The word we have here is Mikedem. We also encountered that word in the Garden of Eden when we were trying to figure out whether the garden was east or west in Edom, because Mikedem technically means from the east, and that's what we've got in the text here. In the story of the Garden of Eden, most of the commentators, most of the translators say that it means to the east, eastward. So it's hard to tell what this word means. Chuck Missler has suggested that Mount Ararat is not up here, but actually down here in the mountains of Iran, and that when they moved from the east, they would be coming in a westerly direction towards the plain of Shinar. Shinar, anyway, is where they settled. It's where Bavel was. Remember, I showed you the close proximity of Shinar to the city of Bavel. And just for reference, Iraq, modern day Iraq, is here, and modern day Iran is here. And I wrote those in there. That's why they're so sloppy. So the people said, they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. Now, this was a construction, a facilities building kind of a revolution. Because up until this time, so like ordinary odd-shaped stones were used mainly for building. But now they've learned how to make bricks. They take clay, put it in frames, bake it in the sun or in ovens, and you have really well-shaped, sturdy, strong building materials. So they learned how to bake bricks, and probably just came to the conclusion with this kind of building material, we can build anything we want as big as we want it. So they had brick for stone and they had asphalt for a mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Now, one of the things that commentators usually kind of poo-poo is the idea that the Babylonians thought they could build a tower high enough to reach into the heavens. And that's the reaction usually of people who think that heaven, the third heaven, the place where God lives, is way out there in the universe somewhere, maybe at the far distant end of the solar system, or not even the solar system, but the universe. Other people think it's much closer, maybe just kind of hovering above us. It's invisible, so it's hard, it's hard to tell where it is. I think I mentioned to you that during the early space program, there was some concern that if you start launching rockets up into the atmosphere and through beyond the atmosphere, that they might crash into heaven without even seeing it because it's invisible, the third heaven. So keep in mind also that when the New Jerusalem comes down to earth in the eternal perfect state, it is a huge city that's built on an enormous foundation, about 1,500 miles square, and in elevation 1,500 miles high. So this is a structure that God has made out of building materials that is enormous and reaches way up into the heavens. And that may give us some invitation of the proximity of the third heaven to us, near or far. So, I mean, let's just take this intention at face value, and and just say that the people thought, let's just build it so high that we can reach God. that we can build a building. We can kind of build a stairway to heaven, and reach heaven, and enter once again into the, the good graces of God. So they may have looked at it from that perspective. Usually those who poo-poo that idea say that what they intended to do was to build a religious facility, a tent, or not a tabernacle or a temple on the top of this tower, and they would hold religious celebrations there and hope that their God, whoever he or she was, would join them in their celebrations. Either one of those might be true, but just wanted to kind of give you, I don't know, kind of a broad spectrum of possibilities. Let us make a name for ourselves, they said, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So they are resisting being scattered around. They want to be gathered together. They want to be centralized. They want to be ruled by a kind of singular power. And Nimrod was willing to step into that opportunity. But Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And Yahweh said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. This is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. In other words, all things are possible. So God says, come, let us, plural, three persons of the Trinity, go down and confuse their language that they may not understand one another's speech. So what was God trying to prevent? Even I don't think he was trying to stop the building of the tower because they were getting close to the third heaven. I think what he was doing was he was judging, and he was manifesting consequences of disobeying his commandment to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and scatter abroad and form local, smaller governments. And they were looking at globalism. They were looking at centralized, strong, and probably corrupt central government, and God stopped that from happening. So Yahweh scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore, its name is called Bavel, because there Yahweh confused. I think Bavel means confusion, the language of the people. And from there, Yahweh scattered them abroad over the face of the earth, which was, what he had intended all along. So that's why on our chart, we see first a scattering, a division of the various clans of the three sons of Noah, and then a kind of a mixture, a combining together, a focusing their efforts in one place. And then God judges the Tower of Babel and the efforts at global government, and they scatter once again the Hamites to Africa and Arabia, the Semites to Assyria and Saudi Arabia, then the Japhethites to Asia Minor and Europe, as God intended in the first place. So that's where we will leave the story this time. Our next lesson will be a very exciting part of the Bible because it's called the Age of Promise. And God will choose one individual, Abraham, with which to make a special covenant that involves a lot of promises that God makes to his people, the benefits of which they receive by faith. And so next time we will begin the faith journey of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs of the Old Testament. Let me give you the blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace. And with that, we'll call it quits. Hope we see you next time, dear friends.